And speaking of our current digital era, we may be in a new era of digital communication, but we are certainly not new to digital communication. For this reason, I call my third bit the digital ages. We can begin with the idea that it is speech, more generally the capacity for symbolic communication that distinguishes our species, that makes us human, and language is our first form of digital communication. This is a point made by Paul Watzlawick and his colleagues in a book called Pragmatics of Human Communication. It's a book that helped to shape the modern field of communication when it came out back in 1967. The symbols are digital because they are discrete units. They function as arbitrary representations, and language allows us to digitize the world, to break it down into manageable units of information that our minds can process and ultimately manipulate. In this sense, language is our most basic and essential form of technology. Now, while our first digital age is based on speech, our second digital age is based on forms of notation and especially writing. The second digital age essentially coincides with the transition from tribal societies to what we think of as civilization. Numerical notation is needed to deal with increasingly more complex economies, and the development of calendars, weights, and measures is part of the process. Cuneiform, the first complete writing system, was developed by Sumerian accountants back in 3500 BC in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, that type of writing system is known as logographic writing. It used a single characters to stand for an entire word. This made it possible to divide vocalizations into discrete symbols. If you think about it, we do not necessarily pause in between words when we speak. Uno, dos, tres is one vocalization. But logographic writing turns speech into a series of separate characters, be they cuneiform, hieroglyphic, ideographic, or numeric. 1, 2, 3, just 3 separate numerals. Moreover, in keeping accounts and making lists, writing separated subject from predicate in a way that would be highly unusual in everyday discourse. We don't normally go around saying 1 cow, 2 roosters, 17 chickens, 23 bushels of wheat. If we did, the response would be, what about them? What do you mean? What are you trying to say? Writing decontextualizes language, and all forms of digitization involve a similar process of decontextualization, of taking things out of their context. Now, the development of phonetic writing systems represented a further digitization of speech and writing, and the beginning of a third digital age. First, whole words were broken down into characters that stood for entire syllables. Then came the Semitic alphabet, which reduced the syllables down to a single consonant. Neil Postman has argued that the second commandment in the Bible, which is the prohibition against the making of graven images, was intended to eliminate the analogic mode of communication, communicating by pictures, in order to reinforce the digital mode of communicating by letters. The ancient Greeks picked up the alphabet from Phoenician traders, adding vowels to make it more effective. And to give an example of the continuing significance of the third digital age to our own, it turns out that the fax machine was adopted relatively rapidly in Japan, but the diffusion of email was somewhat slower, especially in comparison to nearby Korea. Why? I mean, the explanation is simple enough. Korea uses an alphabet like our own. Japan uses a syllabic writing system that consists of almost 100 different characters. On top of that, they also add in additional Chinese ideograms and also draw on Roman letters. This makes it relatively more difficult for Japanese to use a keyboard than for Koreans who, like ourselves, use an alphabetic keyboard. And it makes it a little bit easier, more desirable for Japanese to write by hand and use a facsimile, a fax machine. So during the third digital age, writing, and especially the alphabet, opened the door to many forms of digitization. For example, in Asia Minor, in a kingdom heavily influenced by Greek culture, the Lydians minted the first coins, the ancestors of the ocho reales. This occurred soon after the introduction of the alphabet in Greece in 7th century BC. Nearby, in the Greek colony of Ionia, the first philosophers used coins and the alphabet as an analogy, as a metaphor, and arrived at the theory that all matter is composed of discrete units, that is, atoms. Now, as early as the 6th century BC, the Semitic alphabet reached India, where it was gradually adapted and adopted, and in its wake came the Hindu invention of the number 0 and of positional notation in numerals. Without that, we would not have much in the way of mathematics. So in terms of numeracy, in terms of numbers alone, this was the beginning of a fourth digital age. The fifth digital age begins in Europe during the 13th century, when time was digitized by the invention of the mechanical clock. And the sixth digital age originates with the invention of Gutenberg's printing press in the 15th century. In and of itself, forms of printing go back to prehistoric times. Certainly a significant development in the history of printing was the minting of the first coins in ancient Lydia. What Gutenberg accomplished was the digitization of print itself, along the lines of the alphabet, breaking down the single image or page or print down into metal bits, otherwise known as movable type. They could be put together, broken apart, rearranged in innumerable combinations. And by producing multiple identical copies of texts, typography brought with it a new emphasis on standardization. Standardization in the making of books, in spelling, grammar, and education, standardization in legal systems based on written laws and codes, and standardization in weights and measures, ultimately leading to the uniformity of the metric system. As the historian Elizabeth Eisenstein has documented, the printing revolution in early modern Europe made possible the rise of modern science, and with it came experimentation with electricity, notably Benjamin Franklin and his kite back in the 18th century. This led to a seventh digital age based on electricity. Electrical technologies, in turn, brought such mid-20th century developments as information theory, cybernetics, and the first electronic computers, which mark the beginning of our new eighth digital age. So we live in the eighth digital age.